Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 363. In this episode, we explore the momentous final years of the Second Age, culminating in the War of the Last Alliance of Men and Elves. Before we get started, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. Stick 'em up, fellowship. 3, 2, 1. Whoopsht. Boom. Amazing. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, SaberSystems, Melkor27, and KG. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in February of 2024, Shane Wise, Sean S., Doc G., Andrew M., Robert H., Sarah W., John R., Sarah M., John Rice, Ish of the Hammer, David Bigwood, Kat L., Asya V., and Eric B. Thank you all so much for sticking with us over the years. Join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/TolkienRoad. Whenever you join the Fellowship of the Road, it helps us to keep on evering on and lends you some cool perks along the way. Learn more at patreon.com/TolkienRoad. If you're watching, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. Finally, attention binge listeners, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. If you are a 5-star fan of the Tolkien Road, you can really help us out by heading over to iTunes or your preferred source for the show and dropping us a rating and review. When you do that, it helps get the word out about the Tolkien Road, which helps us to keep on evering on. All right. With Elendil and his sons having founded Arnor and Gondor after the downfall of Númenor, Sauron wastes little time in launching an assault upon them, his aim to conquer the free lands of Middle-earth once and for all. The original sources for this portion are primarily Unfinished Tales, Lord of the Rings Appendices, Akalabaith, Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, and Tolkien's Letters. Okay, so in 3429, Sauron attacks Gondor, takes Minas Ithil, and burns the White Tree. So let's establish a couple of things here. So Minas Ithil. In Lord of the Rings, Minas Ithil is known as Minas Morgul. You might recall that Minas Morgul is the city that apparently belongs to the forces of Mordor, where the armies that make this big assault on Gondor originate, and it stands basically right at the foot of the mountains where Frodo and Sam and Gollum go up for the Pass of Cirith Ungol. So Minas Ithil was actually the name of Minas Morgul originally, and it was one of the two towers that were established in Gondor. The other one being, of course, Minas Anor, which in Lord of the Rings is known as Minas Tirith. So Ithil and Anor, right? Anor meaning Tower of the Sun, Minas Anor meaning Tower of the Sun, Minas Ithil meaning Tower of the Moon. Minas Ithil is the home of Isildur at this time. And but Sauron's forces in Mordor, obviously, all they have to do is go over the pass of Cirith Ungol, and they can attack because Minas Ithil is right there at the feet of those mountains on the I believe they're called the Mountains of Shadow, I think, that are right there on the west of Mordor. Let's actually take a quick look at the map just so we can orient ourselves to everything going on here. So here's our map of Gondor, kind of zoomed in right on this region of Gondor. So here we have Osgiliath right there on the river Anduin. We have Minas Tirith, which is Minas Anor at this time. And then we have, let me zoom in a little bit there for you. Maybe a little easier. I got to redraw my circles. All right, so there we have Osgiliath. There we have Minas Anor, a.k.a. Minas Tirith. And there we have Minas Morgul, a.k.a. Minas Ithil, at this time. And so the forces of Sauron come over the Mountains of Shadow here. You can see there, Mountains of Shadow, the Ephel Duath. They come over the Mountains of Shadow here and attack. And apparently they take Minas Ithil and they burn the White Tree. Now, this White Tree was the one that came from the fruit of Nimloth, right? Nimloth being the original White Tree of Númenor. This was the one that was grown from Nimloth because, of course, Nimloth was destroyed by Sauron in his temple his human sacrifice temple to Melkor. But Isildur, of course, had that great heroic deed, where he rescued one of the fruits of Nimloth, and from it, the seedling that became the first White Tree of Gondor grew. But that first White Tree of Gondor did not last very long, because not shortly thereafter, Sauron's forces take Minas Ithil and burn the White Tree, that first White Tree of Gondor, which is in Minas Ithil. Fortunately, again, Isildur, while he's escaping with his wife and children, he's able to save a seedling of the first White Tree of Gondor, and that will become the second White Tree. Again, I've done videos on the different white trees, the kind of descent of those. It's a pretty interesting sort of history. So if you're into that, go look it up on this channel. It is out there. Listen to it in the podcast where it's on the feed. All right. So Isildur, as I mentioned, escapes. He journeys down the river Anduin, and exits into the sea, and then he is going to basically going to come up and around, and perhaps he goes, I'm not sure, it doesn't exactly say where he goes, but he either goes up the Grey Flood or he goes up the Brandywine. Maybe the Brandywine would be the most obvious one, because he's able to go up there and eventually wind up pretty close to Fornost or Anúminas, probably where Elendil would have been residing at that time. But he makes that journey, and all the while Anarion is holding Osgiliath, right? So, and actually Anarion is able to not only hold Osgiliath, but eventually push back the forces of Sauron. Pretty amazing feat by Anarion. Another reason that I hope we're able to see something of Anarion, like we don't hear much about him in the stories, but he is mentioned, and there's in particular this pretty heroic deed of holding Osgiliath while Isildur makes the journey up to Arnor and pushing back the forces of Sauron before they're just completely able to overtake Gondor. So, I think hopefully the TV show Rings of Power will do justice to Anarion and to the great deeds that he accomplished in the course of the show. So far, I think there's been a passing reference to him. Maybe he's alive, maybe he's not in the show, but hopefully they left that door open enough to where they can recover that, because he deserves to be portrayed as a heroic figure. All right. So that's 34:29 for us. All right. So 34:30, the last alliance of men and elves is formed. Elendil learns about Sauron's attacks and makes an alliance with Gil-galad to unite against him and march upon Mordor. It's interesting that this is perhaps the very thing they should have done at the end of the War of the Three Rings: march upon Mordor while they had the advantage and put an end to Sauron once and for all. You might remember some discussion about this. As I'm working on my latest book right now, I've thought a lot about this recently. Why didn't, when in that War of the Three Rings, right, in the middle of the second millennium of the Second Age, Sauron almost overtakes all of Eriador, right? He basically, Gil-galad and the elves of Lindon have to kind of hold the line while they wait for Númenor to arrive. Númenor arrives kind of when things are at their ugliest and their darkest, and Númenor is able to swiftly push back Sauron's forces and basically send Sauron fleeing back all the way to Mordor. And if you think about that, wow, Sauron, his forces overrun Eriador almost completely, and then Númenor's forces arrive in the nick of time and are able to push back Sauron out of Eriador. But why don't they pursue? Why didn't they pursue him? And I've speculated upon this. They have to have known, Sauron's probably going to try again at some point, right? He's a god. It's not like he has just a fixed lifespan, and he's pretty much done for, and he won't be able to mount this assault again in his lifetime. He's a god. He can do this again. Just give him enough time, and he'll pull it off again, right? So it just puzzles me why they didn't try to put an end to him at that point. And and it's something I've I've pondered in this book I'm working on, and I think it's a pretty interesting question. But nevertheless, Elendil seems to get it, and maybe Gil-galad finally gets it at this point. We've got to put an end to Sauron here. So they formed the last alliance of men and elves, and they are going to proactively march towards Mordor to make this final assault upon him. And they gather in 3431. They gather their forces in Imladris, and all of the different men and elves who they're kind of summoning gather there. I think there's other forces that are going to meet them on the other side of the Misty Mountains, because it doesn't really make sense for the other, some of these other forces to journey all the way over the Misty Mountains. But they journey over the Misty Mountains in the year 3431, and that means they don't the big battle. The next big battle is in 3434, and I was thinking about this. That means that Anarion basically has to kind of hold the line until for 5 years, right? And that's kind of a long time, to hold the line against the forces of Mordor. But Elrond later on reflects that this is the greatest host gathered since the War of Wrath, right? The war that ended the First Age, but Elrond actually says, but it doesn't exceed that host, right? So it's a massive host, right? Massive army that's gathered here in this alliance, but it's not necessarily it reminds him of the host that gathered for the War of Wrath, but it doesn't outdo it, right? That was still maybe the most the greatest of forces that Elrond had ever seen. Just as something that occurs to me as we're pondering Elrond, what must Elrond have thought when, he saw Númenor, just slowly descend into these evil ways and then eventually just be destroyed? I mean, you think about it, right? Like Elrond remembers the founding of Númenor. His brother, Elros, was the first king of Númenor, was basically the founder of Númenor. And, it must have been pretty, not just horrible, I mean, it's horrible on any level for, any of the elves to have witnessed that and to have known about it. But it must have been especially awful for Elrond, to know that this kingdom that his brother had founded, his brother was, a heroic figure in his own right, and being the other son of Elendil, and this kingdom is gone now. It's just completely gone. So I just was thinking about how Elrond, what effect this must have had on him to see Númenor just disappear, wiped off the face of the earth like this. All right, so 3434 brings us to the Battle of Dagorlad, the defeat of Sauron, and the siege of Barad-dûr. The forces, like I said, amassed at Imladris and then journeyed over the Misty Mountains. Kind of a cool picture. I'll go ahead and show you. There's a lot of pictures in this section, but we'll go ahead and fast forward to this one. So one of the color images in the chapter, this would be the image of journeying over the Misty Mountains. That would have been a pretty tough journey. I'm sure there were some passes that were, made it a little bit easier. But who do we see here? Well, my guess is this is supposed to be Elendil and Gil-galad. It doesn't say specifically, I don't think. But that would be my guess on the two main figures we see here, the elvish one being in, the lower left corner here, and then the figure of a Númenorian leader being bottom center there. So we're going to read some passages from this section about what this was like to be there. So the first one we'll read: all living things were divided in that day, and some of every kind, even of beasts and birds, and were found in either host, save the elves only. They alone were undivided and followed Gil-galad. Of the dwarves, few fought upon either side, but the kindred of Durin of Moria fought against Sauron. So all elves were on the side of the last alliance of men and elves. We assume that most Númenorians were. Maybe some of the, we know that there were some of these kind of evil Númenorians who had settled in Middle Earth as well, a few generations ago. So it's possible they fought on the side of Sauron. But there were also just men, non-Númenorian men, who would have fought on probably either side as well. But it even says like even of beasts and birds were found in either host, right? The dwarves of Moria were on the side of the last alliance of men and elves, but maybe not many dwarves fought on either side other than them. So anyway, but we can imagine like, wow, this must have been pretty significant, pretty something to really behold. All these different kinds of creatures fighting in both camps. There's also a fairly long passage about the Sylvan Elves and led by Orofair. So I'm not going to get into the whole thing there, but Orofair was the father of Thranduil, and Thranduil being the father of Legolas. So Orofair is the grandfather of Legolas, and the first leader of those green elves that we later think of being in Greenwood, Mirkwood, right? But let's read a little bit about Orofair and his exploits during the battle. Despite the desire of the Sylvan Elves to meddle as little as might be in the affairs of the Noldor and Sindar, or of any other peoples, dwarves, men, or orcs, Orofair had the wisdom to foresee that peace would not return unless Sauron was overcome. He therefore assembled a great army of his now numerous people, and joining with the lesser army of Malgalad, Amdir of Lorien, he led the host of the Sylvan Elves to battle. The Sylvan Elves were hardy and valiant, but ill-equipped with armor or weapons in comparison with the Eldar of the West. Also, they were independent and not disposed to place themselves under the supreme command of Gil-galad. Their losses were thus more grievous than they need have been, even in the terrible war. Malgalad, Amdir, and more than half his following perished in the great battle of the Dagorlad, being cut off from the main host and driven into the dead marshes. Orofair was slain in the first assault upon Mordor, rushing forward at the head of his host, of his most doughty warriors before Gil-galad had given the signal for the advance. Thranduil, his son, survived, but when the war ended and Sauron was slain, as it seemed, he led back home barely a third of the army that had marched to war. So Orofair, on one hand, maybe sounds like a heroic figure. Maybe we got a little bit of Leroy Jenkins going on there, if you know what I mean. Just kind of rushes into battle before the signal. Orofair, and it's interesting to kind of think of these Sylvan Elves as, even they didn't really trust the other, like the Noldor or the Sindar. They were just kind of their own people. But they still join in this battle, realizing that it's in their interest to defeat Sauron along with the other members of the Last Alliance. And then let's read a little bit about the course of battle, the Battle of the Dagorlad. Although the Battle of Dagorlad was long waged and at the cost of many fatalities, the Alliance triumphed at the last. The host of Gil-galad and Elendil had the victory, for the might of the Elves was still great in those days, and the Númenorians were strong and tall and terrible in their wrath. Against Aeglos, the spear of Gil-galad, none could stand, and the sword of Elendil filled orcs and men with fear, for it shone with the light of the sun and of the moon and was named Narsil. Later, Elrond would recollect, I was the herald of Gil-galad and marched with his host. I was at the battle of Dagorlad before the Black Gate of Mordor, where we had the mastery. For the spear of Gil-galad and the sword of Elendil, Aeglos and Narsil, none could withstand. With the battle won, the alliance entered the plateau of Gorgoroth, encircled by the mountain walls of Ered Lithui and Ephel Duath, with intent to bring final defeat to Sauron by laying siege to his mighty fortress of Barad-dûr. Then Gil-galad and Elendil passed into Mordor and encompassed the stronghold of Sauron, and they laid siege to it for 7 years and suffered grievous loss by fire and by the darts and bolts of the enemy, and Sauron sent many sorties against them. So, Sauron apparently had reserved a good bit of power, and obviously he had built this incredible tower of Barad-dûr as a last stronghold, a last fortification, in case he was ever put to siege like this. So it lasts for 7 years, a 7-year siege that they are there. So the Last Alliance is very triumphant in the Battle of Dagorlad, but then they get to this battle and siege of Gorgoroth, the siege of Barad-dûr, and it takes 7 years for the next events to happen there. In 3440, Anarion is slain. 3440 would be 6 years before, 6 years into the siege, and it actually says he's slain by a stone cast from Barad-dûr. So, we can kind of think of picture in the Peter Jackson Return of the King when they're launching, those they're catapulting those stones into Minas Tirith. It would seem that Barad-dûr had a lot of things like that, and so they were casting, maybe large stones out into the siege force of the last alliance of men and elves, and unfortunately, Anarion is killed by one of those. So that is the end of Anarion. Also of note here is that the crown of Gondor is derived from the Númenorian battle helm, and the original crown of Gondor was originally the actual helm worn by Isildur. Although by the time it rolls around to Aragorn, it may be just kind of derived from that battle helm, so it's not necessarily the original battle helm of Isildur. And then finally, in 3441, Sauron is overthrown. Unfortunately, before that, we have the fall of Gil-galad and Elendil. Sauron, of course, comes out himself to battle, perhaps realizing that this last alliance is not going anywhere, and that maybe his only chance is to destroy it. Himself, being a god, equipped with the ruling ring. And while he does manage, it says he wrestles with Elendil and Gil-galad. He manages to kill them both. But the alliance somehow overcomes Sauron, and Isildur cuts the ruling ring from his hand. And so Sauron is defeated and flees away. It says, so just to say what happens to Sauron, he forsook, it says this, then Sauron was for that time vanquished, and he forsook his body, and his spirit fled far away and hid in waste places, and he took no visible shape again for many long years. So he had only had this current body, current embodiment, for only a few years, because he had lost his previous fair visage when Númenor fell, and he was cast down into the abyss. And then he was no longer able to look fair. He now looks foul and frightening. But he loses that foul and frightening visage as well here, and he's basically just kind of a spirit, a wraith in the wilderness at this point, hiding in waste places, and especially without that ruling ring. But he's one of the powerful god. Learned a lot from the super powerful Melkor. It's going to be hard to keep him down. So let's go ahead and read Elrons Epilogue here. As is told in the Fellowship of the Ring, long after the battle that saw not just the fall of Sauron, but also that of Gil-galad and Elendil, Elrond half-elven would speak of those days at the Council of Rivendell. Fruitless did I call the victory of the last alliance? Not wholly so, yet it did not achieve its end. Sauron was diminished, but not destroyed. His ring was lost, but not unmade. The Dark Tower was broken, but its foundations were not removed, for they were made with the power of the ring, and while it remains, they will endure. Many elves and many mighty men and many of their friends had perished in the war. Anarion was slain, and Isildur was slain, and Gil-galad and Elendil were no more. Never again shall there be any such league of elves and men, for men multiply and the firstborn decrease, and the two kindreds are estranged. And ever since that day the race of Númenor has decayed, and the span of their years has lessened. So, although they achieve this great victory over Sauron, and they banish him from Mordor, and it seems like they will have peace finally, there is the unfortunate matter of Isildur. And despite all of Isildur's heroic actions leading up to this, he fails in a critical way, and that is in the destruction of the One Ring. He is unable to bring himself to destroy the One Ring, which he takes possession of, having taken it from Sauron's hand. And even at the urging of Elrond and Círdan, Isildur won't surrender the ring, takes it as Wergild, insists that this is something that has come to him because he took it from Sauron, who had killed his brother and his father. And Isildur returns to Minas Anor, aka Minas Tirith, not Minas Tirith yet, but it's Minas Anor at this time, and he plants the second White Tree of Gondor in memory of Anarion, and he sets his son Menelil as king of Gondor. And so he has this kind of king of Gondor, the son of Anarion, the heir of Anarion, and he returns north with his sons to take the kingship of Arnor. But you know the rest of the story, right? There's actually a fairly long account of it in Unfinished Tales that is worth a read. We looked at that in episodes 214 and 215. It's called The Disaster of the Gladden Fields. It's very interesting, kind of gives the whole details of how that all went down with Isildur being attacked on the way back to Arnor, and fleeing, putting the ring on, and then being betrayed by the ring, and being killed by orcs in the wilderness. And that's how the ring comes to rest in the waters of near the Anduin, up in the region of the Gladden Fields, and then many years later is eventually found by Smeagol, actually found by Daigle and then taken by Smeagol, and you kind of know how that story all progresses. And that's really the matter that brings us eventually to the whole story of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So let's just consider some of these images. Really, lots of images in this passage. We already looked at, of course, the image of the Last Alliance journeying over the Misty Mountains. But we have first the image of the burning of the White Tree in Minas Ithil in 3429. Pretty ominous image there. And then we have this image of Weathertop. So I take this to be maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm misunderstanding this image. I take this to be Weathertop, but here's the thing. I think this is portraying Elendil et Amansul, aka Weathertop, looking for Gil-galad, as it says in this passage, right? It says, during the Hobbit's journey toward Rivendell, Strider alludes briefly to Elendil, Gil-galad, and their alliance with reference to Weathertop. It says, yet once it was tall and fair, it is told that Elendil stood there watching for the coming of Gil-galad out of the west in the last days of the alliance. It was a great watchtower. This looks like Weathertop at the end of the Third Age, not the original Amansul, the tower that was built there, right? This looks like the ruins of that tower. So I don't know. Maybe I'm misunderstanding what this is supposed to represent. But when I see the two figures on the right there, I just think that looks probably like Elendil there waiting. So kind of scratching my head about that image. Still a cool image, but I'm kind of scratching my head about it. Next, we have the Vale of Imladris. I believe that's what this is. So not a lot of detail to that, but still a pretty cool image. We have the banners of the Last Alliance. The Battle of Dagorlad, I believe, is what this represents here. The Last Alliance crossing the Misty Mountains, of course. And then we have Gorgoroth at the feet of Barad-dûr, right? So this would have been kind of a view that the Last Alliance would have had while they were holding Barad-dûr in siege. It just looks like a really mighty fortress. Really cool image right there. And then we have Isildur's helm, of course, which the Crown of Gondor was eventually based on. And then the Battle of Gorgoroth and the Shards of Narsil. All right, so those are lots of cool images there in those several chapters. All right, so having reached the end of the Second Age, with all of its tragedies and heroic deeds, we have one last important question to consider. How could Sauron, defeated with such seeming finality, ever rise again? For the last episode in this series on the fall of Númenor, we will consider the appendix titled A Brief Chronicle of the Third Age of Middle-earth. In it, we will come to understand that while physical warfare might be enough to restrain evil, it is not ultimately enough to put an end to it forever. What then is? Are we doomed to be under the threat of the shadow forever, or is there some way to ultimately destroy evil altogether? We'll take up this question in episode 364 and lay the groundwork for the Tolkien Road's epic return to The Lord of the Rings, the book that takes on the eternal question, how can evil be defeated once and for all? All right. So one episode to go, you guys. One episode to go in the fall of Númenor, we'll probably revisit certain aspects of it at some point. It's a nice it's been a great compilation to have of all these different matters of the Second Age. There's another appendix that I'm not going to cover as part of this series, but I plan to cover at some point in the not too distant future, perhaps as a patron only reward. So if you're interested in that, head on over to patreon.com so you get it as soon as it's released. All right, well, let's look at a little bit of correspondence. This one's from Zephyr Optional, who I believe I've read correspondence with Zephyr Optional before. This is about 2 months ago, and they said, The Fall of Númenor should be required reading for all nation states. Thanks again for another fascinating dive. Yeah, I agree. It's definitely, that thought has crossed my mind many times. Just so much of it seems like strangely appropriate to our own times. Especially just the notion of having gotten away, so far away from like the things that made you strong and great in the first place, of moving from a position of trust, of like good traditions and the things that have been passed on to us, and kind of going the opposite way and like embracing evil as though it were the good. You actually see that happening in our day and age, and that was something that very much was a mark of Númenor towards the end of its history. So wholeheartedly agree with that comment. And it's a fascinating thing to consider. So thanks a bunch, Zephyr Optional. As always, keep the correspondence coming. We'll do our best to respond to you somehow and at some point. Don't forget to stop by TrueMistPress.com for great merch like super stylin' and comfy Tolkien Road t-shirts, 2 Trees camper mugs, and signed copies of my books. Once again, that's TrueMistPress.com. Thanks for supporting our work with your purchase. And thank you to our amazing patrons, especially the following: John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, SaberSystems, Melkor27, KG, Emilio P, Jonathan D, Richard K, Robert H, Paul D, Julia, Werty, JoeBagelMan, Matt R, John W, Eugene D, Alaskan Moose 31, Chris B, Daniel S, Cory C, Carolyn S, Emiel K, Seb M, Brian O II, Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T, Redhawk, Shannon S, Brian O I, Zeke F, James L, Chris L, Asya V, Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C, David of Pints with Jack, and Eric B. All right. Thanks, everybody. Truly appreciate our fellowship, and thanks to everybody for watching and or listening. We will talk at you next time. Bye-bye.